Wonderful. Well, welcome everyone. It's so nice to be here, and we have a very distinguished panel. We'll be traveling around the world, hearing about different immigration and inequality issues. We're going to start with Simon Behrman, who's a lecturer in law at the University of East Anglia School of Law in England. And he, in addition to teaching international humanitarian and refugee law, teaches public international law, and has been working at undocumented immigrant movement both here and
Great, thank you very much. And I also have to add my thanks as well to the organisers of this event. It's been fantastic. I found people very friendly and encouraging, and I've learnt an incredible amount from the various papers that I've heard, so thank you also to everyone who's given papers here. So yes, immigration policy. Immigration policy has historically, well, for the last 100, 150 years, has been typically divided into two different frameworks. That of economic migration, so people moving to take jobs or get a better life and so on and so forth, and refugee policy, so people who have been persecuted seeking asylum. And typically, the economic migrant areas has been sort of seen as being not really connected to human rights, whereas the refugee policy has been seen as being a species of humanitarian or human rights law. And I want to argue that this division, this split between the two, actually denies protection, not just to people who are economic migrants, to the poor and dispossessed who are seeking a better life elsewhere, most obviously, but also to people who are, we typically think of as the sort of classical refugee. And I think the first thing to say is that in human rights law, there is apparently a right of migration, which is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 13, it says that all persons have the right to leave their countries, to leave their nations. Of course, that's a rather abstract right, because of course you can leave your state, but then where do you go? And by definition, you have to go to another state. And control over borders and the right of states to decide who can and cannot enter their sovereign territory is an absolute cornerstone of international law. And so in many ways, I would say that right is quite meaningless. You know, yes, of course, you can leave your state, but then if you're going to leave, you have to go somewhere else, and that is where the barriers very quickly come up. But I would also argue that the distinction between the two groups of refugees and economic migrants is actually a false one. And the idea to try and artificially say, oh, there are some people who are, you know, suffering and being persecuted, and that's quite distinct group from people who are just moving because they want to earn a few more bucks, is false and denies people sort of fundamental human rights in a general sense. Now, if we just look at immigration or labor migration policy first, it's quite obviously discriminatory against the poor. Typically these days, the only people who can gain a work visa or residency visa are those who have sufficient skills, earning power, education, and so on and so forth. So, for example, in the UK, where I'm from, you need a minimum income of, or the job promise of an income of £20,000, that's about, I think, $30,000, just to get into the country. And now you need £35,000 a year, which I guess is about $50,000 a year, in order to have the right to remain. And that, of course, excludes people, never mind actually just the poor, but even people of relatively sort of middle income from gaining entrance. The point system that's used in Australia, again, also discriminates against people with low skills, the same with the categories used for immigrant visas into the US. And indeed now in the European Union, we have something called golden visas. I don't know if people have heard about golden visas, even the name. And this is, by the way, not a pejorative term. It's one that are used by people flogging these things. You can Google this, look it up. But golden visas are basically certain countries within the European Union offer people who have a certain amount of money that if you, for example, in Hungary, if you have €500,000 lying around and you invest that in Hungarian government bonds, you will get residency and after a few years citizenship, which also means you get EU citizenship because of course part of the European Union. Spain offers something similar, €300,000. If $500,000 is a bit out of your reach, and you can buy citizenship and movement within the European Union. But then, even within refugee policy, there is discrimination and a privileging of people who have more skills and more access to resources and so on than the poor. I should say, first of all, there's a lot of careless talk about the so-called right of asylum. People talk about this. Even lawyers I've seen talk about a right of asylum. There is no right of asylum in international law. In Article 14 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it says that all persons have the right to seek and to enjoy asylum. It's a rather curious phrase, to seek and enjoy. And you should know that the original draft was the right to seek and to be granted asylum. And state parties in the process of negotiating this draft just said, no, we can't have that. We can't have, essentially a burden put on state that we have to grant the right of asylum to anybody who demands it. And of course, even then, I mean, the Universal Declaration is a piece of soft law. It's not hard law, but even then, states could not accept that. So it was changed to this sort of mealy-mouthed, the right to seek and enjoy. And I always joke with my students, there's something missing there. You have the right to seek something, and then you have the right to enjoy something, but the missing link is to get that something, But, so certainly there's no right to asylum there. In more hard law human rights treaties, such as the 1966 Covenants or the European Convention on Human Rights, there's no mention of the right of asylum. The cornerstone of international refugee law, which is the 1951 Refugee Convention, there is a sort of passing reference to a right of asylum in the preamble. Not in the main body of the text, but in the preamble. And interesting enough, if you read the Travaux Préparatoires, the working conference that put together the treaty, a number of states said, even in the preamble, what about this right of asylum? We can't have that. And the president of the conference, according to the transcript, reassured everybody to say, no. The right of asylum we're talking about is the right of states to grant asylum, not the right of refugees to get it. And even in the preamble, it's sort of mentioned, I said in passing, but it's mentioned in terms of it being a burden upon states. So the right of asylum is a burden for states, not a right of refugees. Moreover, the definition, the crucial element of the 1951 Convention, and it is, by the way, this convention has been, about 150 states are now parties to it, so it is very much the dominant framework. In order to qualify for asylum, there are some very strict criteria that you must meet. Namely, you must be outside of your country of nationality first to claim it. 2, that you must have suffered or have a well-founded fear of being persecuted. And 3, that persecution must be to a certain set of reasons like political opinion, religious belief, and so on. Now, I think there are various ways in which those criteria discriminate. So, for example, you have to have the means and the ability to have crossed a border, okay? And I should tell you that the most recent figures I've seen from, I think, 2014, according to UNHCR, there are something like 50 million displaced persons in the world, of which only about 15 to 16 million are people who are classified as refugees. So the vast majority of them are people who are still within their states. Also, the point about persecution, which is central, is that persecution assumes and it privileges only those people where there has been, if you like, an identified persecutor who has committed a specific act or series of acts against an identified victim, the putative refugee. And of course that ignores all sorts of things about structural violence, things like climate change, being in war zones, etc., that discriminate against people with less means and people who are generally at the bottom of the pile in places of conflict. Now, what I want to suggest is that in these circumstances, and in circumstances where the world is becoming ever more unstable, and of course you can look at the Middle East, of course, but also where climate change-induced displacement is, on conservative estimates, we're going to see something like 50 million people, possibly up to about 200 million people displaced by the middle of this century, that it is with some urgency that we need to consider reframing and asserting a right of migration. And in terms of trying to assert this right, we need to identify what is the nature of this right, to whom does the right belong, and very crucially, I think, who has the corresponding duty to honor this right, or against whom can this right be claimed. And here I want to look really at the example of the sans-papiers movement in France. And just, how many people have heard of the sans-papiers? A few people, okay. So the sans-papiers are, literally means people without papers. They were a group of undocumented, we might call them undocumented migrants in France in the mid-90s, who really exploded onto the scene in the spring and summer of 1996 when they occupied a number of churches, trade union offices and other buildings in Paris, demanding that their immigration status be regularized, that they be given papers and so on. They were mainly made up of sort of two groups of people. One group of people who essentially been, I think, economic migrants to France, whose papers for various reasons had expired or whose papers had been rendered obsolete. I mean, one crucial element for them was that in France, then and still now, residency was tied to a work permit. And of course, a work permit was tied to a particular employer. So if you were sacked by your employer, then automatically you would lose your residency. And you can imagine the kind of power this gave to employers and the level of exploitation that was taking place with migrant workers. The other group involved in this were people whose claims for asylum had been denied. Okay? And as I said already before, it's very easy to have a claim for asylum denied, or put another way, it's very hard to succeed in gaining a claim for asylum. Now, I just want to talk about a number of ways in which the sans-papiers, if you like, defined themselves and asserted their rights, which I think could point the way to something, to if you like, a real human right or a more progressive right of migration. First of all, there's the constitution of their self-identity. The term itself, sans-papiers, before 1996, they were typically referred to in France as clandestins, as people who were hidden, or we might more likely translate that as being a sort of illegal alien. And they called themselves sans-papiers, and this is sort of a rejection of this notion that we are somehow being hidden, and they said, they made statements, we are here, we have been here for years, we work, we live here, we're part of the community, and to treat as if we are some kind of hidden, non-existent part of society. But also, of course, there was an echo with another very famous people who grew up in France, the sans-culottes, who were the sort of radical edge of the French Revolution, who stormed the Bastille. These were the sort of working poor of Paris. And so there was an echo of that. But also very interestingly is the sans-papiers linked up with other groups of what we might call a sans, of people, the have-nots. And there were movements of people around sans logement, people without housing, people without jobs, and they linked up. In other words, we are all, if you like, what we share as an identity. And it's not about migration status or citizenship or so, but that we are, if you like, the have-nots. And they formed that kind of self-identity as being part of, if you like, the poor and dispossessed in France, if you like, not simply migrants. And that was very important in terms of strengthening their movement, but of course overcoming the sort of xenophobic way in which governments try to split off or to play against migrant labor versus domestic or, if you like, citizen workers. Another key element of the movement was their demand from the very beginning was papers for all. And again, this was important because it goes back to the thing about refugee determination, for example, which was we look at each person individually. Can you prove that you have a right to be here? Or when the government was sort of bending to the movement a little bit, saying, okay, we will relook at some cases, it was saying, well, there are some people who are deserving of stay, but some people have committed some crimes, even minor crimes. They don't deserve to stay. Or some people haven't integrated sufficiently into French society, so they don't deserve to stay. And the claim of the sans-papiers was very clear: papers for all. In other words, it's not so much about saying giving to the state the right to determine which one of us can stay, but asserting for ourselves the right to be here. Finally, one other central element of the movement, when they did their first occupation, and this is something they just realized, they looked around, they did a sort of assessment of who was there, and they found that everyone there had come from countries like Mali, Algeria, Senegal. You see there's a pattern here. These were all former French colonies. And one of the leading figures in the movement, Migrant Cissé, who was from Senegal, a very interesting woman in many ways, both the role she played and her analysis of it. And she wrote shortly afterwards saying this awareness, or the awareness of who they were and where they were from, was an awareness of the debt owed by France and also the dependence of our home countries on France. And this played an important role in both the initiation and in the course of the struggle of the sans-papiers, who came from these former colonies. The rebellion of 18th of March, that was the date they occupied the first church, resembled an attempt to claim this historical debt that had never been honoured. It was a jolt, a revolt to say, we no longer want France to continue subjugating us in the same way that it has with the states of countries of origin, with exploitation, contempt, and paternalism. And very much this was also a response to the famous, or an infamous comment of Michel Rocard, who was then the Prime Minister of France, I'm just going to round up on this, who famously said, we cannot accommodate all the misery of the world. And essentially what the sans-papiers are saying, well, the misery of the world is your responsibility, and so far as that we represent that, we have come here to claim a debt owed to us. So really, I'm just saying, in sum, that the sans-papiers, what they have done is reconstitute. And they still exist, and they still occupy, and they still, it's an ongoing struggle even 20 years later, is reconstitute the right of migration as one that belongs to the poor and dispossessed, one that is shared between both migrant labourers and, if you like, indigenous, if you want to put it that way, labour and indigenous workers. And most importantly, they've claimed it as a right to be asserted against the countries of the global north, of the rich, that it is something that is owed to the poor. And this very much cuts against, I think, the sort of notion that we have in the rich countries of, who are all these people coming here and placing a demand on us? Actually, we have a right and a duty and a debt owed to them. So I'll end with that.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to our own Denise Gilman, who directs the immigration clinic here at UT. And she also is just coming off a term at the ABA Commission on Immigration with the American Bar Association and helped author their report on immigration.
Thank you. And I don't know that you've actually fully introduced yourself, Elissa, but so to be clear, Elissa and I teach the immigration clinic here at UT Law together, so we're close colleagues. But I also want to thank the conference organizers for this opportunity, and also to blame them a little bit for forcing me to think about the immigration detention issues that I have been obsessed with for a number of years from the viewpoint of income inequality and human rights issues in that framing. So I'm going to speak today about massive detention of migrants as a question of economic power and powerlessness. And I think that fits well within the theme of the conference once they forced me to think about it in those terms. Because it's not exactly about discrimination on income, nor is it exactly about poverty, the way I'll be thinking about immigration detention, but it is clearly about money and economic power. And the role of money in immigration detention has been discussed for some time, but I do think it advances the conversation somewhat to think about that role of money in the sense of inequality, of who has the money and who is influencing the system. I want to be clear that the immigration detention system is certainly not sort of only about economic inequality, and I'm not even clear yet that economic inequality is sort of a central factor that should be considered. There are numerous other factors relating to politics, actual ideology about migrants and how they should be treated. And of course, much of the issue is about human rights non-compliance with US constitutional norms that specifically go to basic liberty concerns before you even get to sort of the economic inequality concerns, as those norms really, at both the international and the U.S. level, should limit detention and make it the exception to be used only where necessary on their face, but yet the economic factors are absolutely influencing the way or the extent to which those direct norms are being implemented. So, I think the premise here is that economic equalities between the various actors in the system do explain much about the detention system. I think the factors of economic inequality even affect the vision of the extent to which power and powerlessness is acceptable in the immigration detention context. If you think about it in these terms, it posits big corporations, which are often seen as contributing jobs, as economic engines, and therefore sort of desirable actors. Maybe not in this room, but in general. I think that's a fair description of the way the corporate actors involved in immigration detention are seen. And juxtaposing those actors against poor immigrants who are seen as a draw on society's resources in the way that has just been discussed to a certain extent. And so therefore, sort of almost an underlying assumption comes into play that perhaps it is acceptable that those desirable actors who bring economic benefits have greater influence over the system than those who would be a draw on our system. So just to describe a little bit more about what our system looks like before getting into these economic impacts. In the U.S., the Department of Homeland Security detains more than 400,000 migrants each year. That's about 34,000 beds usually filled with migrants each and every day. And money plays an important role in that structure, both at the macro level in determining the structure of immigration detention and at the micro level in dictating whether particular individuals are going to be detained, and that's what I'm going to look at. So on the structural side, the for-profit prison industry seeks ever greater levels of immigration detention and has the ability to effectuate policies that achieve that expansive immigration detention. Large private prison companies have profited sufficiently from detention of migrants that they now wield even greater economic power over Congress and other policymakers, which then feeds into a cycle of continued and increased detention. And they use that economic power and the influence that comes along with it to secure policies favoring detention of the immigrants at the federal level, such as, for example, there is a congressionally ordered daily detention bed mandate. Beginning in 2010, Congress has mandated that 33,000, and then now it's increased to 34,000 detention beds be available and paid for every single day. No other law enforcement agency anywhere that I know of, certainly not in the United States, has a quota on how many people they must lock up, yet the private prison industry has been able to achieve such a quota in the immigration detention world. The immigration detention for-profit companies also use their influence derived from wealth to determine the nature of detention. They obtain contracts to detain in facilities that they design and manage. So the government puts out a bid for contracts, and the private prison companies come in and bid on those projects and usually win them because of their ability to influence policymakers. And then they decide then what the facilities look like. And because the private prison companies that are involved in immigration detention are private prison companies, they come from the correctional world, the models that they use, their efficient business model of detention is very much a prison model. And so the type of immigration detention that takes place follows that exact model because it's what the corporations have on their shelf that they can pull out and use to bid on contracts and to detain. And the private prison companies who do this are very clear about what they're doing. They absolutely see immigration detention as a profitable business model and source of income. They regularly report to their shareholders about the likelihood of ever expanding detention as a possibility for increased business and revenue because of the ability of the industry to affect policy thinking and discourse to suggest that migrants should be detained because of the need for a law enforcement response to these immigrant communities. And the private prison industry is making huge profits off of this. Let's be very clear about that. Revenues for the second quarter of 2015 for GEO, which is one of the major private prison companies, increased from the previous year to $446 million. That's 1/4 of a year. It's in the billions, the amount of money that the companies are making off of it. And then, of course, as I sort of mentioned at the beginning, it becomes a cycle. Through ever-increasing profitability, the companies obtain additional influence. They can lobby, offer campaign contributions, even conduct white paper policy analyses that affect detention. So let's just kind of look a little bit at what this looks like and tie it into what has happened in terms of growth with immigration detention over the last decade plus. So as you can see, corporate lobbying by the two major private prison companies, Corrections Corporation of America and GEO, really sort of shot up about 2004, 2005, 2006. And similarly for campaign contributions, so there are a number of ways that these companies use money to influence the process. Again, around 2006. And that's actually not completely arbitrary. That it's not that they just sort of all of a sudden decided they would start lobbying the federal government for increased immigration detention. It came about largely because at the state level, states started engaging in prison reform and started refusing to spend quite as many dollars on the construction of new prisons and detention of individuals as a cost-saving measure largely, and because there are constituencies at the state level that could push for that reform that don't exist as easily, again, because of the economic inequalities at the federal level relating to immigration specifically. So you just saw that. Now look at where immigration detention bed space starts to increase, and you can see that it really is quite dramatic around between 2005 and 2007. And mind you that a lot of people trace expansive immigration detention to 1996 laws that were sort of draconian immigration detention laws, and that's certainly a source for increased immigration detention. But it's actually a decade later that it really starts to kick in, right around the same time that the private prison industry turns its attention to immigration detention. So, and now this influence has even led to sort of beyond immigration detention, the private prison industry has managed to sort of capture other aspects of our immigration enforcement system. So now in addition to running the private detention centers, these large corporations also have extensive electronic monitoring programs that are used for many migrants who are released from detention. So rather than being released with some case management or other support system, they're released with electronic surveillance. GEO owns by far almost all of, if not all of the electronic monitoring that is used in the immigration detention context. It's about 10,000 migrants now who are on electronic monitors run through GEO as well. So in this picture, migrants to be detained or otherwise restricted are essentially commodities with almost no power to influence the structural decisions made about detention. Even though the GEO group has, for example, a human rights policy, that concept of the human rights of the migrants being detained has almost zero impact in the overall economic structure of this, where the business model is so successful. So I want to just show that in addition, or at the same time as the immigration detention population is skyrocketing, as a policy matter, immigration detention essentially makes less and less sense, even if you believe that it has some role in the immigration enforcement system, because actually unlawful or irregular migration is at historic lows at the same time that we're increasing the immigration detention bed space. So I just want to acknowledge this is also about distribution of wealth. Remember that these are shareholder companies. These are public companies. So the profits that are being made out of this system are being distributed to those wealthy shareholders who are able to invest in these companies, once again, at the expense of the individual migrants who are detained. And while we don't necessarily think of many of these migrants in detention as being workers, because so many of them are recent arrivals in terms of their economic role, in fact, many of the families or many of the individuals who are in immigration detention were economic contributors, wage earners in the United States before they were detained. Because in the U.S. legal system, even lawful permanent residents, green card holders who've been here for many years, who are supporting families and working in the labor market, are absolutely potentially subject to detention. In fact, many are in detention each year. So it's redistributing from those workers to the shareholders of the company. I wanted to talk about the kind of micro level as well, but I spent too much time on the larger macro level. Let me just quickly say that this structural reality at the big picture of increased immigration detention also impacts individual detention decisions regarding individual migrants when it's being determined by the Department of Homeland Security whether or not they will be detained in kind of two ways. So the structure means that you've got 34,000 beds each day that have to be filled. So the way it works when a detention decision is being made is mostly, well, do we have 34,000 detention beds full or do we not? So rather than focusing on whether any individual person who might be detained is a flight risk or a danger to the community, which are supposed to be the factors considered in detention, it's much more about whether or not the beds are full, whether or not the economic consequences are there. And so if there are beds available, people are detained. If not, they are often released. But it also, money also affects the individual detention decision because monetary bond is the central way through which immigration detention takes place, is determined in the United States. There is generally not a true presumption of liberty when you go into the detention decision-making process, but rather a presumption of detention and then the possibility for release on bond. And then as the process goes through, then that bond-making process is generally what determines whether or not somebody will get out of detention. So that obviously has very serious implications based on inequality. If a monetary bond is imposed and you do not have the money to pay it, then you stay in detention, regardless of any flight risk or danger to the community. If a monetary bond is imposed and you have the wealth to be able to pay it, and these are high bonds, $10,000 is a very typical bond, and they are paid in full, unlike in the criminal justice system, then if that's a high bond and you can pay it because you have the resources, then you get out. There's been very broad recognition in the criminal justice system that monetary bond is very problematic for this exact reason. It means that those who are detained are those who are least able to afford release, rather than those who are sort of present the greatest explanation, justification for detention. And yet, this is what's playing out every single day in the immigration detention context with very little critique. For now, hopefully there'll be more in questions. You wanted to show me all pictures. CCA flag.
So now we all know where to invest our money, sadly. And someone who knows the detention setting well, Ryan Jones, who's one of our current clinic students and has been representing Old Detention, but is going to take us now to the other side of the world and to look at some issues in terms of worker exploitation. He is also a staff editor at the Texas Journal on Civil Liberties and Civil Rights, and last summer interned at KPIU.
So yeah, as Elissa said, the paper that I wrote focused mostly on the Gulf Cooperation Council, which is a political economic union of 6 countries in the Arabian Peninsula. Those 6 countries are Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. And the paper sort of focuses on the system of migrant labor that exists there, and specifically on the labor law that is used to sort of govern that migrant labor. There is a provision or a system called Kafala that essentially ties a lot of these migrant workers to a sponsor, or typically that sponsor is their employer. And that system has come under a lot of criticism through NGOs, through other governments, as being abusive and exploitative. But I guess in my paper I sort of focus on a critique that was done by Susan Marks, who's a law professor at the London School of Economics, sort of saying that this typical mode of thinking of the root cause analysis that a lot of NGOs use is sort of problematic. It doesn't quite go far enough. So just to lay a little more of a foundation, I was going to start by talking a little more about the history of the GCC, which is to say that within the last 150 years, it's sort of seen a huge increase in its wealth, starting in the 1930s, when there was a huge oil boom. And they were relatively underdeveloped, relatively sparsely populated nations at the time, and they all struck oil. They all became very wealthy at the time, and there was a huge push to sort of develop these nations. But because they had pretty small native populations, they had to sort of pump in a lot of workers from overseas. And initially, a lot of those workers were coming from neighboring Arab nations, but then in the 80s and 90s, there was more of a push to bring those workers in from South Asia, in part because a lot of these governments in the GCC thought that they were a little less ideologically threatening, and frankly, a little easier to sort of segregate and underpay and exploit. And so, now the number of migrant workers that exist in the GCC is pretty staggering. I think the latest numbers I had were about 48% of the region's entire population are non-nationals, and that number is as high as 88.5% in the UAE. And not surprisingly, a lot of these migrant workers are coming from very poor nations in South Asia. I think 90% of remittances that are flowing out of the GCC go to 8 countries in South Asia, all of which are developing economies according to the United Nations. So in order to deal with this sort of broad system of migrant labor, these GCC nations have created some labor law, like I said, that we talked about Kafala at the beginning, which ties these migrant workers to a sponsor. The sponsor is typically their employer, and the sponsor's role is usually to procure the migrant's visa at the outset, and then beyond that to just sort of serve as a proxy for the workers in dealings with the government. But one of the more concerning aspects of this system is that these sponsors, these kafils, because they are usually their employer, the migrant's employer, they ought to have some economic stake in ensuring that the employer stays there, and ensuring that the employee stays there, and the employee doesn't change jobs or really receive any more benefits than they need to. So not surprisingly, the system has been criticized, and not surprisingly, there have been a decent number of reports of human rights violations that have occurred, not the least of which are predatory recruiting practices that begin before the migrants even get there, start in labor source nations where there are recruiting organizations set up, where they promise to set you up with an employer in the GCC, and sort of outline how much you'll make and what you'll be doing, and they require an upfront fee for that, which most of these workers can't afford. So they'll take out loans, or they'll mortgage whatever little property they have, and in turn end up showing up in the GCC in worse financial condition than they left their home nation. There's also issues with insufficient and non-payment of wages once they're in the GCC. They'll be promised a certain wage and either not paid it or just not paid at all. I think typically a non-payment period is anywhere from 3 to 10 months. There were reports that some workers were not paid for as long as 31 months. There's issues with passport confiscation. There's issues with exit visa requirements, essentially requiring the workers to get permission just to leave the country, and that's not in every country in the GCC, but a few of them require that. And then I think most of all, and most obviously, there are issues with inhumane living and working conditions, which are about what you would think. Living, up to 8 people in a room, unsanitary conditions, physical abuse, long hours, lack of safety and oversight. And so the response has been pretty damning. NGOs have sort of come together and universally condemning Kafala and the overarching labor law system in the GCC. In 2014, for example, There were 90 human rights organizations that signed a unified call for labor ministers in the GCC to increase protections for migrant workers, and that sort of started with repealing Kafala. In 2014, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights issued an opinion that pegged Kafala as a source of abuse in this part of the world. And there's just been generally a strong push to sort of fight back against labor law as it currently exists in this region. And so to sort of test that theory, I looked at Bahrain as a case study, which sort of has led the way in addressing some of these issues. In 2006, it created an organization called the Labor Market Regulatory Authority that was supposed to sort of separate the dealings of employees with employers and provide a little more protection to employees. And then in 2009, Bahrain tried to sort of repeal Kafala altogether. They implemented a requirement that employers can no longer restrict employees from switching jobs or changing jobs as long as the employee gives a notice period, which cannot legally exceed 3 months. They did a number of other things, which include, guaranteeing services to migrants with or without passports, and just sort of overarching reform that at the time was lauded. And Human Rights Watch, HRW, released a statement or a report at the time saying that this was going to dramatically improve the status of migrant workers in the GCC. And then 3 years later, HRW kind of realized that wasn't the case. And they had a very, very long, in-depth report talking about a lot of the issues that were still facing these migrant workers, and a lot of them sounded very familiar. There were still issues with passport confiscation. There were still issues with these employers restricting movement. That 3-month notice period that I mentioned earlier, within a year, I think, was pushed to a 1-year notice period, and that was changed as a result of pressure from the business elite and the GC in Bahrain specifically, and it was done without any sort of consultation with the Bahrain trade unions that were supposed to represent the workers' rights to the LMRA. And so essentially, it didn't seem like these reforms did a whole lot. And so the question for me was, why not? And I think that is what took me to Susan Marx's analysis of this problem with root cause thinking. And so Professor Marx talks about, there are sort of 3 issues that she takes with root cause analysis. And the first is that typically organizations or people that engage in this root cause analysis don't go far enough. They'll sort of identify a baseline issue, but they don't look into the sort of overarching framework in which these problems exist. The second is that it can lead people to treat effects as causes, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then the last is that even when proper causes are identified, a lot of the times in the interest of just sort of creating these bullet point lists of easy, digestible solutions, the true causes, the more complex causes, are just kind of set aside. So to Marx's first point with stopping the inquiry short, she sort of argues that you can pinpoint these issues with a system like Kafala that seem to be causing these problems, but you don't really look deeper into the larger framework. And I think within the GCC, the way that seemed to manifest itself is that a lot of these NGOs are considering labor law and considering Kafala as this root cause of these human rights abuses without considering sort of the underlying, or fully considering the underlying cause of migration in the first place, which everyone will acknowledge is typically economic migration. And so without sort of considering why the migrants tend to flow into the GCC, it just seems like you're not really fully considering the problem and fully considering exactly why it is that this system of human rights abuses is allowed to continue. To the issue of conflating causes with effects, Marx uses an example, which is that a lot of the time when you think of a country that has gaps in its labor law and gaps in protection of labor law, that is often said to be a cause of inequalities within the system, when in fact you can think of it as the reverse, which is to say that a lot of the time when you have an unequal system, these gaps in labor law are actually created to sort of maintain the status quo. And in the GCC, that seems to be fairly true. I mean, to use the Bahrain example again, there were attempts to repeal this sort of traditional employer as sponsor element of Kafala, And that didn't really work, mostly because a lot of the employers sort of used similar but slightly different tactics to achieve the same ends. And business owners and sort of the business elite were fighting against these changes all the way. So even when you reform these systems or reform these laws, as long as this sort of overarching system of inequality exists, I think the power dynamics allow the people who have the power to sort of fight back and maintain that status quo. And to jump ahead to Marx's final criticism, which is root cause analysis tends to cause critics to set aside legitimate causes. I think that's true in this instance, in the sense that HRW, as I mentioned, will acknowledge that economics do play a huge part in the decision to migrate, but then they don't really consider that in outlining any sort of response to the human rights violations that occur in the GCC. Specifically, a lot of the remedies focus on bureaucratic problems and legal problems in the host nations, without actually mentioning or discussing ways to improve economic conditions in the labor source nations. And so that kind of led me to this question of how you even incorporate consideration of economic inequality into this issue. And that led me to an article by Eric Posner and Glenn Weil, who are University of Chicago professors. Glenn Weil is an economist, Eric Posner is a legal professor. And they made an argument that essentially said that the current system of migrant labor as it exists in the GCC is doing more to combat economic inequality globally than any other system in the world. And the reason that they sort of make that argument, the crux of the argument, is that because there's such a heavy flow of migrants from such poor nations, and because remittances tend to be the most efficient way to get money from a rich nation to a poor nation, because you're not losing as much money to corruption, to capture by sort of wealthy elites. The idea is it's sort of the most direct way to go about it. And they acknowledge readily that there are some pretty atrocious human rights conditions in the GCC. They don't dispute that in any way, but the way that they phrase it, I think, is they refer to them as uncomfortable trade-offs that have to be made. So I think their argument is sort of summed up by saying the GCC model of accepting migrants on economically and politically subordinate terms, though not humanitarian on its face, has proven so in practice. Which was sort of an interesting thought to me because personally I think I had a hard time accepting that idea. And I definitely, I think there are some issues with this analysis. They don't really take into consideration the fact that a lot of the reported income that these migrants are making is not actually what they're taking home. They don't really consider the, withholding of wages. They don't consider predatory recruiting practices. They don't consider the cost of migration in the first place. The fact that you have to be at a certain level of wealth, have a certain level of wealth just to get to a country in the first place. But most of all, I think it just sort of, it's hard to square with this idea, and I think it was summed up well in sort of an op-ed by Alistair Sloan in the Middle East Monitor when he said, it's difficult to explain to a Filipino domestic worker who was raped and repeatedly by her Saudi Arabian employer that her ordeal is acceptable because on average an economist graph shows that her country is getting wealthier. And I think there's something to that. With all that being said, I definitely think that there has to be some consideration of the overarching impact that this system of migration and that a more open approach to economic and labor migration that the GCC is employing does have on the economic situation of a lot of these migrants at home and their families at home, because a lot of them don't have access to a way to increase their earning potential in a way as efficiently as Weil and Posner would say, as they do in the GCC. But exactly how far you take that is something that I'm still sort of struggling to put my finger on.
And last but not least, we have Professor Salvatore Villani, who's assistant professor in public economics at the University of Naples in Italy, and he has been teaching public economics and theory of fiscal federalism, hoping to hear how immigration kind of fits into a healthy economic state.
Yes.
Good morning. First of all, I would thank the conference organizers for their gracious hospitality. I am very pleased to be here today. As you can see, looking at the title of my paper on the slide, I address the issue of the inequality and the resilience of tax and welfare systems, whose resistance and adaptability is now challenged all over the world, but especially in Europe and in the Mediterranean, by the humanitarian crisis caused by the recent refugee crisis. This issue, in my opinion, is strictly connected and intertwined with the debate on the effect of the tax policy on the inequality of, if you prefer, on the inequalities of income, of opportunities, and so on. And my reasoning in the paper starts from the issue of migration and governance and its socioeconomic impact in the European Union. Like I said, this is a crucial issue, relatively unexplored and undervalued in the political debate. In fact, the policies adopted by the European countries and the European institutions to analyze and counteract the phenomenon have not produced any positive results. On the contrary, they have revealed once again all disease which affected historically Europe. Organizational myopia, slowness, inefficiency, and inability to overcome internal strife and international aid. The political debate has focused, however, on the allocation of the economic burden produced by this emergency situation, precisely on the estimates of the costs related to the emergency to be deducted from the calculation of the national deficits, rather than on the issue of its possible economic and social impact in a decisive moment in which inequalities are rising and new forms of poverty are emerging. Moreover, the policy leaders of Europe, adherents of a peculiarly narrow view of the strategic priorities and policies to generate a smart and sustainable and inclusive growth, have not allowed, have not encouraged a public discussion on this issue, preferring once again a unilateral discussion, a decision taken in secluded financial corridors. This paper aims to fill, at least partially, this informational and democratic deficit by addressing from a particular review angle the issue of migration management and its socioeconomic impact, attempting to demonstrate how a wise management of international and internal migration combined with a risk management or a resilience culture could represent a valid response to the above-mentioned organizational myopia. In particular, the paper tries to clarify the reasons why immigration, if properly managed, could be viewed as a resource, rather than a problem, as a blessing, and it could be used as an efficient tool of income redistribution to eradicate income inequality and a new form of poverty. For this purpose, through a critical review of the most recent theoretical models and empirical research on the relationship between migration and inequality, and a personal empirical investigation related to the Italian case, the paper tries to show how out-migration can increase income inequalities, thus hindering economic growth and exacerbating regional disparities, while immigration or better, some time of immigration can reduce income inequalities and mitigate economic imbalances, according to the hypothesis of skilled immigration equalizing formulated recently by Kanek and Zimmerman. The paper aims also to demonstrate the extreme importance of the issue of the redistributive impact of the movements, of the population movements inside EU's member states. In this view, the paper shows that improving the redistributive function of tax and welfare national systems and increasing their resistance, that is increasing their ability to withstand sudden change, sudden demographic, social, economic, and environmental changes, and to recover or to rebound from them, represent essential preconditions to eliminate vulnerabilities of the individual European states' socioeconomic systems and correct the organizational myopia of the European institutions. Here is a list of the topics and the issues treated in the work. The above-mentioned issue of the relationship between migration and inequality is a part of a wider doctrinal debate on the economic impact of immigration, which has become increasingly important in the recent years. But on this debate, I'm going to delve further now for lack of time. I would only remember that the numerous studies on the relationship between migration and income inequality in the destination countries reached conflicting results. One of the reasons for these differences is due to the diversity in the research methodologies adapted. Some of these studies are listed on this slide. Among these, we must mention the article of Boreas, Freeman, and Katz, where the scholar noted that the growth of unskilled migration may exacerbate the income gap between the native workers more educated and those less educated. But subsequent research has revealed that also this kind of analysis could be influenced by the features of the data set utilized and by the assumption made by the researcher. Therefore, it's not inconceivable that immigration has a zero or negligible impact on the income inequality. Such as in Paris analysis, which summarizes an abundant literature on this issue, an abundant literature composed by 27 studies published between 1982 and 2013. And it is not inconceivable that immigration can generate an equalizing effect, namely a smoothing gaps effect, especially when the level of education of the professional experience of immigrants are very high. As argued by Kanek and Zimmerman. Kanek and Zimmerman have analyzed, both from a theoretical and empirical point of view, the relationship between economic inequality, the quality of labor force, and international migration in developed countries, receiving inflows of migrants that vary across country and over time in terms of their skill composition. And they found, in a nutshell, that international immigration of high-skilled immigrants may reduce income inequality in the destination countries. And this problem has been addressed, has been discussed by Xu and other scholars. This study is very interesting because it explores the possibility that some type of immigrants may contribute more to higher income inequality than other immigrants. All these findings cannot be underestimated and must be reconsidered as a whole, especially in the light of the most recent economic studies on the impact of economic inequality on medium-term growth, and the negative impact on the medium-term growth. Taking into account these findings, currently some scholars argue that migration could have an important role in the reduction of inequality, because it happened in the past, as affirmed by John Kenneth Galbraith in his book on the nature of mass poverty, and it could happen also in the future, as it is possible and desirable. And, but we argue that migration in itself would not resolve the issue of inequality. At most, it would shift this forward, as recently noted by Piketty in his last book. It does not exempt from previously creating a minimum set of rules and institutions to aimed at incentivizing a major coordination and collaboration by governments at international, national, and local level to change the present management of a system of migration in order to take into account the interest of migration and their source country and areas. In some recent works written with my colleague Luigi Ferrara and Giorgio Liotti, I've tried to test this hypothesis of skilled immigration equalizing. In a nutshell, we found that a positive net migration rate, that is the differences between the people entering and leaving in the country, divided by the average value of the population, may be able to reduce the value of Gini coefficient. We considered single country data at a regional level for several reasons. First of all, like we have seen before, because the literature, the results of the studies carried out so far depend very often on the differences in economic, social, and institutional characteristics of countries. Because Milanovic, in his last book of 2016 on global inequality, argues that class-based inequality within country became more important rather than location-based inequality. And because Italy, in terms of immigration, is certainly an emblematic case, because through its history, it has been from time to time, it has been a country of immigration, of internal migration, and of immigration from abroad. And we have nowadays a new internal migration, new wave of internal migration that is different from the past, from the internal migration of the economic miracle. And as this new internal migration from the south to the north of a country is different. The current recession was not able to curb the transfers of residents from southern to northern Italy. And this new internal migration is different because is characterized by a minor scale of the phenomenon and a greater selectivity. Young generation with a higher level of education and the female component emigrate to the north and abroad. And this implies the desertification of the Mezzogiorno. Also, the Economist underlined the Italian regional divide. For this reason, we tried to verify the impact of this internal migration. These are the assumptions of our study, and these are the variables implied in the models and the database utilized. the panel data models estimated. And finally, the results. The results that confirm the relationship, the negative relationship between net migration rate and income inequality, that it is negative. And the results does not change regardless of the period we consider, pre-crisis or post-crisis. And the relationship between cumulative changes in Gini coefficient and cumulative net migration rate between 2004 and 2012 confirms this assumption, and exacerbate the situation of inequality in the country, as estimated by this BMETS in 2014. This slide represents the percent distribution of household by region and by quintiles of income in 2014. And as you can see in the south, the income distribution is shifted toward the lower values, and income is more concentrated in the upper classes than in the case of the north. What lesson we can learn from the economic from this economic research and by the Italian from the Italian experience? As suggested by Kanek and Zimmerman, the EU could combine skill-based selection policies with immigration and culturation policies. Designed to increasing the level of education or specialization of immigrants. And on the other hand, we must consider that immigration can increase income inequalities, thus hindering the regional disparities. In this way, it is necessary to adopt policy measures aimed at stimulating the accumulation of human capital and encouraging investment in the source area of migration flow. Fourth, finally, a wise management of taxation and welfare system, both at the national and local level, should ensure a more equitable redistribution of the gains produced by migration, and should mainly help people and skilled workers who remain in low productivity areas, as suggested by Paul Collier in his last book on Migration Exodus. Strategic change in the structure of the tax systems associated associated to an efficient management of the welfare systems, and to a certain degree of coordinated decentralization of the redistributive function can be utilized to influence these migration flows, and in this way to bring each region or countries to its level of efficient immigration, as theorized by Buskovetsky in his article on the relationship between efficient migration and redistribution. And conclude. For this purpose, in my opinion, it is necessary to create useful synergies among immigration and integration policies on the one hand, and the redistributive function carried out by the tax and welfare systems on the other end. But I think by this I finished my presentation.
Thank you very much. Before we open it up, I'd like to sneak in a question. I'm wondering to what extent you see the issue of racism or xenophobia factoring into the topics that you all discussed. Sorry. To what extent you feel that racism or xenophobia factor into the topics, and particularly kind of the structural responses, even the conversation that you just described. You know, it seems to be there needs to be a neutral in terms of the quality of immigrants, and
it seems that racism is actually more the fuel of some of these structural decisions than economics or other policy making.
So kind of for all of you, whoever wants to jump in.
No, I would say that racism is inextricably linked to immigration policy and always has been. If you go back to the first immigration controls that we have in the Western world, say in the United States, in the 1880s it was anti-Chinese. In Britain, the first immigration controls in 1905 were anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish, and so on. And I think, for example, I mean, one of the things that I find particularly offensive at the moment in Europe, we're having a big debate about the European Union, particularly in the UK, where we have a referendum on whether to stay or not. And I find so many people, particularly on the sort of liberal left, saying, oh, isn't it wonderful about the EU? We have free movement within the EU. And of course, the free movement policy of the EU went hand in hand with the policy of fortress Europe. In other words, we can have this free movement within Europe amongst good, cultured, white Europeans, and we can ensure that by having the fortress that stops the global south coming in. So I mean, I totally agree. Is absolutely there. And of course, in the case of the sans-papiers that I mentioned before, I mean, it was, that quote of Rocard, the former French Prime Minister, about the misery of the world is this, even at best, it's like these poor burden upon us, the poor Western, it's a real lack of acknowledgement of the historical injustice done basically by history of colonialism and racism, which underpins it all.
And of course, I would absolutely agree similarly that immigration, detention, and the whole law enforcement approach to migration has a significant racial component to it. There are many examples, of course, throughout U.S. immigration history. You've raised some, but even specifically as to detention, detention of Haitians, release of Cubans upon touching U.S. soil, very much racially motivated. In terms of the individual custody decisions and the role of bond, that is another, the racial component is another factor that has been acknowledged in the criminal justice system that has not yet been acknowledged in the immigration detention system, that the role that bond plays has racial impacts as well, because of course economic inequality and race often go hand in hand and are intertwined, partly because of that, but also because of the way bond decisions may be made, leading to ongoing custody, based not on objective criteria, but based in part at least on racialized criteria. So absolutely throughout the system. Of course, it's worth noting that I've been focused on who's in immigration detention and who gets out. There's a very strong racial component to who never ends up anywhere near immigration detention. And that's also intertwined with economic inequality and race going hand in hand. So most individuals who have resources, white Western immigrants, come on a tourist visa and then fall out of status if they're going to be out of status. They don't approach the border seeking refugee protection and end up in detention.
Yeah, and I just have a little bit to say on this, I guess, but with respect to the GCC specifically, I think the fact that they're relying so heavily on South Asian migrants is not coincidental. From what I've read and researched, it was sort of a targeted or an intentional move by some of these governments who viewed migrants from that part of the world as being a little easier to sort of take advantage of, which was seen as beneficial because you could pay them less, you could lay them off, you could. It was just a cheaper way of doing things, and I think a part of Posner and Weil's argument that I sort of glossed over just for lack of time, but that was still important, is that in addition to it being somewhat beneficial economically, the system of migration, it's also part of their fear was that if you push too much change on these GCC governments, they're going to push back, and essentially it stops being worth it to them if they have to sort of recognize this full social, political, economic system of rights to these South Asian migrants, and they'll just go with migrants from a different part of the world that maybe aren't quite as poor, but are a little more easy culturally to assimilate.
Yes, I consider this aspect, but I want to only underline that that is the importance to create realize profitable synergies to several policies and to several approaches to this issue. Also yesterday when we debate on the impact of fiscal policies, it seems to me that is undervalued the issue of the coordination of these policies and the issue of the different problems of the developed countries and the developing countries. When, for example, when I say of resilient tax system, in developing country is underlined the aspect of the availability of resource. But in the developed country, the problem is different. First of all, I have to debate about the degree of the comprehensive tax system at national, at federal, national, and local level, and the comprehensive degree of progression of the tax and welfare systems. And is relevant the issue of the minimum level of the wage. James Gilbright, in his last book on inequality, said that a high minimum level of wage may reduce immigration, especially illegal immigration. There are several aspects that have to be considered, in my opinion.
Thank you. All of these were really fascinating, and I learned a lot. I have a question for Denise. I was wondering if there are any efforts to make alliances of the type that Simon described in France, right, where the sans-papiers linked up with other have-nots, but who of French citizenship. If there are any efforts to fight against Immigration Detention, Inc., by linking up perhaps with the fight against private prisons in general that affect American citizens, and also more broadly, you talked about the redistribution. So some of these immigrants in detention are formerly taxpayers, and so this is a redistribution from them, but it's also from all of us who pay taxes. And so to make, and if there are efforts like that or potential for that, is there also a danger in kind of shifting the problem? The victim is no longer the immigrant who is being detained, but it's us, the general population who are.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting set of questions. I think that where there are the beginnings of alliances are between the immigration detention world and the criminal justice world, not so much in general between migrants and other low-wage workers, although maybe some of that too. But certainly there's very new, I think, really kind of dialogue taking place between advocates in the criminal justice world and in the immigration detention world to point out the inequalities of the system, the way it impacts the redistributive concerns and taxpayer expense efficiency concerns. And while those always make me a little bit nervous, I think there are some policy advocacy reasons why you might, at least as part of the discussion, want to raise the impact on taxpayers and on the fisc more generally. So I think there is a little bit of that there. Where I see the biggest kind of risk in, or even shortfall of kind of joining those two discussions, is that then I feel as though it does potentially leave out the recent arrival migrant who is a more traditional refugee type migrant. And I think that has in fact happened in recent years. I think this administration has seen the sort of civil rights nature of some of the demands of dreamers, of young people who are undocumented as part of an overall civil rights movement that should address marginalized communities, whoever they are, whether documented or undocumented, migrant or not migrant. And similarly, in the criminal justice world, this administration has seen the importance of beginning to look at over-incarceration, and at least there might be some openness to considering where immigration detention fits into that. I think in some ways that civil rights view of the issue has allowed the administration to really employ an otherness lens for looking at recent arrivals of Central American refugees, particularly at the border.
My name is Sacco. I teach at the University of Rome. I would like to say two things. One about the story of the right to migrate. The right to migrate has been very popular in Europe for many years, for many decades, meaning that any Briton could settle anywhere in the world, at least in the British-dominated three-quarters or half of the world. And this makes that the British have kept for a long time the idea of jus soli. Whenever you are, in 1 year, that's your country, okay? And actually, this was seen, was also in Italy. The idea was that the Italian poor had the right to migrate wherever it was, in Libya, in Ethiopia, was seen the other way around, okay? But there are other countries in Europe. One is Germany. The crisis, the center of the crisis today, but really in these very few recent months, has been Germany. And Germany has always been the idea of belonging and settling or being German was based on a completely different idea. You are born German. You cannot become German. And this is still the official theory. This is difficult to understand from the American viewpoint, which is a country of immigrants. You are born German. And some recent concessions that have been done for Turkish immigrants, that they can vote, some of them can vote, is a concession, doesn't go against, is not a change in the German approach. You are born German. And now the entire crisis that we have in Europe is due to another factor, is that two countries in Europe, Germany and Italy, are, with Japan, the countries with the worst birth rate in the world. There are nobody's being born. Since '64, practically nobody's being born. Okay? That's it. If the population is normally represented with a triangle, okay, so-called pyramid of age. If which you put, you know what it is. You put from age 0 to age 110, now because we go a little over 100, and then you put people, girls born on one side and boys born on the other side, and you have, of course, it becomes rapidly a triangle because from the first year people start dying, and in the end there was nobody left, okay? Now, if you look at the pyramid of age of Germany and Italy and Japan, they look like a kind of the tip of an arrow, okay? There is a large triangle at the top, and then a very thin part down. Of course, it moves up regularly every year after year, and you have an enormous number of people over 65, and an increasing number, over 65 is more or less the age when you retire in Europe, and a very thin number, a very small number of people into the working age. Moreover, you have a very rapidly increasing number of people over 85, which not only do not work, but require assistance. The length of life, which is already 3 years more in Europe than in the US, increased by 1 year every 3 years, the length of the expectation of life. Okay? Which means that from a general viewpoint, the living conditions in Europe improve, because there would not be this increase in the length of life if whatever you have, environment, whatever, in pollution, all in all, the conditions improving, okay? Because people live longer.
I hate to interrupt,
sorry, okay.
but I'm just mindful we do have a session starting next. Was there a question, or did you?
No, I just want to make one point. I'll reduce it to one point. This is the origin of the present policy, immigration policy in Europe. We have to take people in, young people in, that would not create political problems the way France did, because France tried a different way and has created a lot of terrible problems. I put 2 examples. Britain had a less serious but a similar problem. So when 10 Eastern European countries entered the European community and acquired all the rights of being members of the European community, except the right of migrating, Britain, which is always very reluctant against anything, say, no, why should we prevent these people from migrating inside Europe? Because they had calculated that there were about 4 million between Polish and Romanians that were ready to migrate. And these had 3 privileges. They were white, they were Christian, and they had reasonable technical education, okay? So the British and the Swedes took all of them, because the others were very reluctant to give the right to migrate to the new members. Okay, and got the best that was available from a racial viewpoint. Okay, for Germany was left with a second choice, and second choice is what they are trying to get now, which is Christians, Yazidis, and people who are persecuted by ISIS, who are afraid of ISIS, that they want to take, because they assume that by bringing these people in, they won't bring Islamic extremists, because these are the enemies of the Islamic extremists. So it's an entire politically racial thing that is going on. The right to migrate is not existent. It's a purely theoretical moral question that some people like you suggest now and then. But it's a very pragmatic population problem that we have. I won't go into Italy because it's even more sophisticated, because, by the way, we were smart enough to snatch plenty of Romanians to the English, and to get enormous number of Filipinos that are Christians. Okay.
Well, I definitely think there is much more to discuss.
Okay.
This could go on for many, many hours, weeks. I think we're all struggling, but thank you to our panelists.